The gentle breeze of a late summer evening swept across Oak Grove's historic district, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Wilson's carefully tended garden. At 73 years old, she had made it her daily ritual to spend these peaceful moments on her front porch, a tradition spanning back to when she first moved into this beautiful Victorian house over 40 years ago. The porch was her slice of paradise. Its weathered wooden floorboards had witnessed countless moments of joy, from neighborhood children stopping by for her famous lemonade to community gatherings that had brought the street together. Today, like any other day, she sat in her favorite rocking chair, her weathered hands working skillfully on a cross-stitch pattern she planned to give to her granddaughter. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, casting a warm glow over the tree-lined street. Mrs. Wilson hummed softly to herself, a habit she developed during her 30 years as a school teacher. Her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she counted stitches, occasionally looking up to wave at passing neighbors, walking their dogs or pushing strollers. The peace of the moment was perfect, the kind that made you appreciate life's simple pleasures. The old-fashioned porch lights had just started to flicker on up and down the street, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere that had always made this neighborhood feel like home. Children's laughter echoed from a few houses down, where a game of evening tag was winding down as parents called them in for dinner. Mrs. Wilson paused her stitching to reach for her glass of iced tea, the condensation making it slip slightly in her grip. The ice cubes clinked against the glass as she took a sip, savoring the sweetness of the drink made from her mother's recipe. She smiled, remembering how this very porch had been the place where she'd taught her son to read, where they'd shared countless summer evenings watching fireflies dance across the yard. Her peaceful reverie was suddenly interrupted by the harsh screech of tires against asphalt. The abrupt sound made her hand jerk, nearly dropping her cross-stitch. 2 police cruisers had pulled up sharply in front of her house, their headlights blazing unnecessarily in the dimming evening light. The cruel glare cut through the gentle atmosphere like a knife, casting strange shadows across her carefully maintained flower beds and the American flag that had hung proudly by her door for decades. The squad car's doors opened with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the previously tranquil street. Mrs. Wilson's heart began to race, but she kept her composure, years of handling classroom crises having taught her the value of remaining calm in tense situations. She carefully set aside her cross-stitch and straightened her cardigan, watching as the officers approached her property with an urgency that seemed entirely out of place on this peaceful evening. Little did she know that this moment would mark the beginning of an incident that would not only change her life, but would spark a transformation in her beloved community. As the officer's heavy boots clomped up her front path, crushing a few of her prized petunias in their haste, Mrs. Wilson took a deep breath and sat up straighter in her rocking chair, her dignity unwavering despite the growing unease in her chest. Through her window, the warm yellow light from her living room still glowed steadily, a sharp contrast to the harsh blue and red lights now flashing across her front yard. The porch, which had been her sanctuary of peace just moments ago, was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would ripple through Oak Grove and beyond, touching hearts and minds in ways no one could have predicted on this seemingly ordinary evening. The 2 officers strode onto Mrs. Wilson's porch with heavy footsteps that made the old wooden boards creak in protest. Their faces were set in stern expressions, hands resting near their belts in a way that made Mrs. Wilson's heart skip a beat. She'd seen that stance before, just never directed at her, and certainly not on her own front porch. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity at this address," the taller officer announced, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the evening air. His flashlight beam swept across the porch, lingering on her cross-stitched supplies and half-empty glass of iced tea, as if they might somehow be evidence of wrongdoing. Mrs. Wilson's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she responded, "Officer, I live here. I'm just enjoying my evening, as I have done for the past 40 years. She reached for her iced tea, more to steady her nerves than from thirst, but the second officer stepped forward abruptly. "Don't move, ma'am. We need to see some identification first," he demanded, his hand now resting more firmly on his belt. The first officer had moved to block her access to her front door, as if she might suddenly flee into her own home. The absurdity of the situation might have made her laugh if it weren't so frightening. Here she sat in her gardening clothes and comfortable shoes, her silver hair neatly pinned back, being treated like an intruder on her own property. The porch lights cast shadows across the officers' faces, making their expressions seem even more intimidating. "My identification is inside," Mrs. Wilson explained calmly, drawing on decades of experience handling difficult situations in her classroom. "If you'll allow me to step inside, I'll be happy to get it for you." She kept her voice level, though her heart was racing beneath her cardigan. "That's not going to happen," the first officer replied sharply. "How do we know this is really your house? We've had reports of squatters in this neighborhood." His tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about her presence there, despite the family photos visible through the window and the well-tended garden that spoke of years of loving care. Mrs. Wilson felt a flash of indignation rise in her chest. The garden trowel she'd used that morning still sat in its holder by the door, her name painted carefully on its handle by her granddaughter. The welcome mat beneath their feet had been a housewarming gift decades ago. Every inch of this property told the story of her life here. "Officers, I can assure you," she began, but was cut off by the second officer's harsh command to remain silent. The situation was escalating, and she could feel control slipping away like water through her fingers. The peaceful evening had transformed into something tense and dangerous, all because she dared to sit on her own porch. Through her window, she could see her family photos on the wall, graduation pictures, holiday gatherings, celebrations of life's precious moments. The contrast between those happy memories and the current situation made her throat tight with emotion. But Mrs. Wilson had lived through too much history to let fear overwhelm her dignity. Lights were coming on in neighboring houses now, curious faces appearing in windows. The flashing police lights had drawn attention, casting an eerie blue and red glow across the street where children had been playing just minutes before. She could hear screen doors creaking open, footsteps on other porches, the murmur of concerned voices. The officer's aggression seemed to grow with each passing moment, as if her calm demeanor somehow provoked them further. They exchanged glances, their hands never straying far from their weapons, creating an atmosphere of threat that felt completely out of place in this peaceful neighborhood. What should have been a simple conversation had somehow turned into a confrontation that made Mrs. Wilson's peaceful porch feel like a stage where a dangerous drama was unfolding. Little did these officers know that their actions were being witnessed by more than just the gathering neighbors. Soon, their behavior would face scrutiny from someone who understood the law far better than they did, and the balance of power on this warm evening was about to shift dramatically. The sound of screen doors squeaking open echoed down the street as neighbors emerged from their homes one by one. Mrs. Wilson's next-door neighbor, who had lived there for 20 years, was the first to step forward. She stood on her own porch, phone in hand, her face a mixture of concern and determination as she began recording the scene unfolding before her. "That's Mrs. Wilson," she called out firmly, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "She's been my neighbor for 2 decades. What are you doing on her property?" The woman's words seemed to give others courage, and more neighbors began to gather on their porches and at the edges of their yards. The officers shifted uncomfortably as they realized their actions were now being documented by multiple cell phones. The harsh glare of their cruiser lights illuminated a growing crowd of concerned faces. An elderly man from across the street had stepped onto his lawn, still holding his garden hose, water dripping quietly onto the grass as he watched with growing concern. "I've gotten your son on the phone," Mrs. Wilson's neighbor announced, her voice steady and clear. "He's on his way." She kept her phone raised, recording every moment, every movement. The mention of Mrs. Wilson's son seemed to create a ripple of tension among the officers, though they tried to maintain their authoritative stance. A young couple who had just moved in down the street joined the growing crowd of witnesses. The wife whispered something to her husband, who nodded and disappeared back into their house, returning moments later with their own phone held high. More neighbors were arriving now, some still in their work clothes, others in casual evening wear, all drawn by the commotion and the unsettling sight of police cars flooding their peaceful street with spinning lights. Children peered out from behind their parents, confused by the scene before them. One little girl clutched her mother's leg, staring wide-eyed at the officers who were still preventing Mrs. Wilson from entering her own home. The child had just received a cookie from Mrs. Wilson that afternoon, a regular treat that the kind elderly woman loved to share with neighborhood kids. "We all know Mrs. Wilson," another voice called out from the gathering crowd. "She taught half our children at Oak Grove Elementary before she retired." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled neighbors. Someone mentioned her famous holiday cookie exchanges. Another recalled how she'd cared for their cats during a family emergency. The officers began to look increasingly uncomfortable as the community rallied around their neighbor. Their earlier aggressive stance had softened slightly, but they still maintained their positions, caught between backing down and escalating the situation further. The taller officer spoke into his radio, his voice too low to hear, while his partner kept glancing nervously at the growing number of recording devices pointed in their direction. A retired postal worker who had delivered mail to Mrs. Wilson for 15 years stepped forward from the crowd. "I've brought her packages to this very porch for over a decade," he stated firmly. "There's no question about whether she belongs here. The real question is why you're harassing an elderly woman on her own property." The atmosphere had transformed from one of isolation to one of community solidarity. Every person present understood the significance of what they were witnessing, and no one was willing to stand idly by. The street that had always been known for its friendly gatherings and block parties was now united in protection of one of its most beloved residents. Through it all, Mrs. Wilson maintained her composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arms of her rocking chair. The cross-stitch pattern lay forgotten in her lap, a testament to how quickly this peaceful evening had turned into something else entirely. But now, surrounded by the support of her neighbors, she felt stronger. These were the people she'd shared life with, whose children she'd taught, whose joys and sorrows she'd witnessed over decades of community life. The flashing lights of the police cars continued to paint the scene in alternating red and blue, but they no longer seemed as threatening. The community's presence had changed the dynamic, transforming what had started as an intimidating confrontation into a powerful demonstration of neighborhood unity. And in the distance, the sound of an approaching car signaled that another significant change was about to occur in this unfolding drama. The sound of a car engine cut through the tense atmosphere, and heads turned as a sleek black sedan pulled up smoothly beside the police cruisers. The car's door opened with a quiet click, and Mrs. Wilson's son stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed business suit, his leather briefcase held firmly in one hand, and his expression calm but determined. The crowd parted silently as he walked up the path to his childhood home. His polished shoes crunched softly on the gravel, each step measured and purposeful. The officers straightened their postures instinctively, recognizing something in his bearing that demanded respect. Here was someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of courtroom experience. "I'm Mrs. Wilson's son, and I'm also a civil rights attorney." He placed his briefcase down carefully on the porch steps, the sound seeming to echo in the now quiet street. "Would you mind explaining why you're preventing my mother from entering her own home?" The taller officer cleared his throat, his earlier aggression faltering slightly. "Sir, we received reports of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Mrs. Wilson's son interrupted smoothly, pulling out his phone. "Would that be the suspicious activity of an elderly woman sitting on her own porch, doing needlework?" His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he spoke. "I'm already documenting every aspect of the situation. Now, could I have your badge numbers, please?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand finally moving away from his weapon. The change in dynamics was palpable, like watching a balloon slowly deflate. Mrs. Wilson's son continued speaking in that same measured tone, but now he was reading off specific legal precedents, citing cases that made the officers' faces grow increasingly concerned. "Mom," he said softly, turning to Mrs. Wilson while keeping the officers in his peripheral vision, "are you all right?" His professional demeanor cracked slightly as he looked at his mother, allowing a glimpse of the worried son beneath the lawyer's exterior. Mrs. Wilson nodded, managing a small smile that carried decades of maternal pride. A police supervisor's car pulled up quietly behind the other vehicles, its arrival drawing murmurs from the gathered crowd. The supervisor stepped out, immediately recognizing Mrs. Wilson's son from his reputation in the legal community. The atmosphere shifted again as the supervisor approached, his face showing he understood the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Wilson's son turned to address him, but not before picking up his mother's fallen cross-stitch and gently placing it back in her lap. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the man who had gone from playing on this very porch as a child to standing there now as his mother's protector. The neighbors watched in fascination as he calmly laid out the series of violations that had occurred in the past 30 minutes. His words were precise and measured, but carried an underlying current of controlled anger. He pointed out the crushed petunias, the unnecessary show of force, the baseless detention, all while referencing specific legal statutes that made the original officers look increasingly uncomfortable. The supervisor listened intently, occasionally nodding, while taking notes on a small pad. The flashing lights from the police cars continued to illuminate the scene, but now they seemed to highlight a different story, one of justice being calmly but firmly demanded, of power being held accountable, of a son protecting his mother in the most effective way he knew how. Throughout all of this, Mrs. Wilson remained seated in her rocking chair, her back straight, her dignity intact. She watched her son with quiet pride, remembering all the evenings she'd spent helping him study on this very porch, all the dreams she'd had for his future, all now coming full circle in this moment of protection and justice. Some of the neighbors had lowered their phones, but others continued recording, understanding that this moment might prove significant beyond their small community. The young couple from down the street whispered to each other about how differently this situation might have ended if Mrs. Wilson's son hadn't been who he was, hadn't known what he knew. As the conversation between her son and the supervisor continued, Mrs. Wilson picked up a cross-stitch again, her hands now steady. The simple act seemed to say more than words could about resilience, about carrying on, about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. The evening breeze had picked up again, carrying with it the scent of her jasmine flowers, a gentle reminder that this was still her home, a sanctuary, no matter what had just occurred. Mrs. Wilson's son opened his briefcase, pulling out a small notebook while maintaining his composed demeanor. The leather creaked softly as he retrieved his pen, the simple action carrying the weight of years of similar moments in courtrooms across the country. His voice remained steady and clear as he began documenting every detail of the incident. "Let's start with the initial approach," he said, addressing the supervisor while glancing at his notes. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, for what was described as a suspicious person report. He paused, letting the absurdity of the situation sink in. A suspicious person who happens to be a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher sitting on her own porch in broad daylight doing needlework. The supervisor, a veteran officer with graying hair at his temples, nodded grimly as he took his own notes. The 2 original officers stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier bravado completely deflated. The taller one kept adjusting his collar, while his partner couldn't seem to keep his eyes focused on any one spot. "Now," Mrs. Wilson's son continued, "I've already documented the property damage to my mother's garden." He gestured to the crushed petunias, his phone camera clicking as he took photos. "But what concerns me more is the psychological impact of being treated as a criminal on one's own property." His voice carried just enough edge to make the officers wince. The neighbors who remained watching created a respectful silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of evening birds and the soft whir of phone cameras still recording. The young couple from down the street had been joined by their elderly parents, who watched the proceedings with knowing looks, as if they'd seen similar scenes play out decades before. Mrs. Wilson's son reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a business card. "I've already contacted our law firm's civil rights division," he explained to the supervisor. "They're particularly interested in the pattern of similar incidents reported in this precinct over the past 6 months." The statement hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy with implications. The supervisor cleared his throat, years of experience telling him exactly how serious this situation had become. "Sir," he began, "I want to personally apologize to your mother." He turned to Mrs. Wilson, who acknowledged him with a dignified nod. "This is not how our officers are trained to conduct themselves, and there will be consequences." As if on cue, 2 more police cars arrived, these bearing internal affairs markings. Mrs. Wilson's son allowed himself a small smile. He had made that call even before leaving his office. The new arrivals approached with professional courtesy, their notepads already out as they began taking statements from the gathered neighbors. "We'll need copies of all video recordings," Mrs. Wilson's son announced to the crowd. "Please send them to the email address on my card." He began distributing his business cards to the neighbors, each one eager to help document what they had witnessed. The young mother who had been recording since the beginning stepped forward, mentioning she had captured everything from the initial aggressive approach. Throughout all of this, Mrs. Wilson remained a picture of dignity in her rocking chair. She had resumed her needlework, each stitch a quiet act of resistance, showing that she wouldn't be driven from her own porch by anyone's misguided assumptions. Her son paused occasionally in his documentation to check on her, each glance carrying years of love and respect. The internal affairs officers moved methodically through their investigation, their presence adding another layer of legitimacy to the proceedings. They interviewed each neighbor carefully, their professional approach a stark contrast to the earlier confrontational attitude of the patrol officers. One of them photographed the damage to the garden, measuring the distance from the street to the porch, creating a thorough record of the scene. As the evening wore on, more neighbors arrived, drawn by text messages and social media posts about the incident. Each new arrival was greeted with quiet updates from those who had witnessed everything from the beginning. The community's solidarity was evident in every shared glance, every supportive nod, every offered statement to the investigating officers. Mrs. Wilson's son maintained his professional demeanor, but those who looked closely could see the tension in his jaw, the carefully controlled anger in his eyes. This was more than just another case to him. This was personal. This was his mother. This was his childhood home. Yet he channeled that emotion into methodical, legally sound action, transforming a moment of injustice into an opportunity for systemic change. The sun had fully set now, and the porch lights up and down the street cast a warm glow over the scene. The police supervisor stood at the bottom of Mrs. Wilson's porch steps, his cap held respectfully in his hands. The moment felt heavy with significance as he cleared his throat to make his official statement. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "on behalf of the department, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for what happened here today." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What these officers did was completely unacceptable and goes against everything we're supposed to stand for." The two original officers had already been escorted to their supervisor's car, where they sat completing detailed incident reports. Their badges and service weapons had been temporarily surrendered to internal affairs, standard procedure for an investigation of this nature. The lights of their patrol cars had finally been turned off, allowing the natural peace of the evening to return. Local news vans had begun arriving, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky. Reporters stood at a respectful distance, waiting for official statements. One of them recognized Mrs. Wilson's son from his high-profile civil rights cases and whispered excitedly to her cameraman. The story was already spreading across social media, with hundreds of shares and supportive comments flooding in. "The officers involved will be placed on immediate administrative leave," the supervisor continued, now addressing both Mrs. Wilson and her son. "We're implementing an emergency review of our community engagement protocols, and we would very much appreciate your input on this, sir." He nodded respectfully to Mrs. Wilson's son, acknowledging his expertise in civil rights law. Mrs. Wilson's next-door neighbor stepped forward, still holding her phone. "I've already uploaded the video to 3 different cloud services," she announced. "Every minute is documented from the moment they pulled up until now." Other neighbors nodded, indicating they had done the same. The young couple from down the street mentioned their security cameras had caught everything from another angle. The internal affairs officers had finished their initial interviews and were now coordinating with the police supervisor. Their presence had brought a level of accountability that seemed to reassure everyone present. They spoke quietly but firmly about immediate policy changes and department-wide training initiatives. Mrs. Wilson finally stood from her rocking chair, her movement drawing all eyes to her. Despite everything that had happened, she maintained the same grace and dignity that had marked her years as a teacher. "I accept your apology," she said to the supervisor, her voice gentle but firm. "But I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else in our community." Her son placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his expression. The neighbors broke into spontaneous applause, the sound spreading down the street like a wave. Even some of the reporters couldn't help joining in, moved by the simple power of her words. A small girl, who had been watching everything from behind her mother's legs, suddenly broke away and ran up to Mrs. Wilson. She held out a slightly crushed daisy, picked from her own yard. "For your garden," she said shyly, "to replace the flowers that got stepped on." The simple gesture brought tears to several observers' eyes, representing hope for a better future in the most innocent way. The police supervisor noted this moment too, visibly moved. He announced that the department would not only replace Mrs. Wilson's damaged flowers, but would also sponsor a community garden program to help build better relationships between law enforcement and residents. It was a small step, but one in the right direction. As the evening drew to a close, news crews began setting up for their live broadcasts, preparing to share this story of injustice transformed into opportunity for change. Mrs. Wilson's son spoke quietly with civil rights activists who had arrived on the scene, already planning how to use this incident as a catalyst for broader reforms. The neighborhood had witnessed something powerful, not just the confrontation of injustice, but the triumph of dignity, community solidarity, and professional advocacy. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Mrs. Wilson's porch stood as a symbol of resilience and hope, its warm light shining out into the gathering darkness. 3 months had passed since that eventful evening on Mrs. Wilson's porch, and the changes in Oak Grove were remarkable. The once crushed petunias had been replaced by a flourishing community garden that stretched along the entire block. Every Saturday morning, residents gathered there to plant, weed, and share stories, often joined by off-duty police officers who had embraced the chance to build real connections with the community. Mrs. Wilson's porch had become a symbol of something much bigger than that one evening's confrontation. Every Wednesday afternoon, she hosted what the neighbors now called Porch Talks, informal gatherings where community members and local law enforcement could have open, honest conversations about their experiences, fears, and hopes for the future. "It's about building bridges," Mrs. Wilson often said as she poured her famous iced tea for visitors. Today, she sat in her familiar rocking chair, watching a young police officer help a child plant marigolds in what had become known as the Unity Garden. The officer's badge gleamed in the sunlight as he patiently explained the importance of gentle hands with delicate plants. The policy changes sparked by that evening had spread far beyond Oak Grove. Mrs. Wilson's son had worked tirelessly with the police department to implement new training programs focused on community engagement and cultural awareness. Officers now underwent regular workshops that included spending time with community elders, learning local history, and understanding the importance of treating every resident with dignity and respect. The young couple from down the street had started a neighborhood watch program, but with a twist, it focused on bringing people together rather than creating suspicion. Their monthly block parties had become legendary, with residents and police officers sharing food, stories, and laughter under the same stars that had witnessed that tense evening 3 months ago. Local schools had incorporated lessons from the incident into their curriculum. Mrs. Wilson, coming out of retirement for special occasions, visited classrooms to share her story. But she always emphasized hope over anger, progress over resentment. "It's not about dwelling on what went wrong," she would tell the students. "It's about working together to make things right." The media attention had faded, but the real work continued quietly and steadily. The police supervisor had kept his word about departmental changes. New officers were now required to spend their first week walking the neighborhood beats, meeting residents, and learning the community's stories. They started their rounds on Mrs. Wilson's porch, where she shared not just her experience, but her vision for a better future. The internal affairs investigation had led to broader reforms across the entire police department. Body camera footage was now reviewed regularly for training purposes, with a focus on positive community interactions as well as areas for improvement. The 2 officers from that evening had undergone extensive retraining and, upon their return to duty, had requested to be part of the community engagement program. Mrs. Wilson's neighbor, who had first recorded the incident, had started a community documentation project, teaching residents how to safely and responsibly record interactions with law enforcement. But these days, most of what she recorded were positive moments: officers playing basketball with local kids, helping elderly residents with groceries, attending community events. The little girl who had offered the daisy now had her own small plot in the Unity Garden, right next to Mrs. Wilson's restored flower bed. Every afternoon, she would carefully tend to her plants, often accompanied by different officers who would stop by during their rounds, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere and the chance to be part of something healing. As autumn approached, the community prepared for their first Unity Festival, planned to be held right there on the street where everything had changed. Mrs. Wilson's porch would serve as the main stage, decorated with strings of lights and flowers grown in the community garden. Local businesses had donated food and supplies, and the police department had volunteered to help with setup and security, not as an imposing force, but as part of the community. Looking out from her porch one evening, Mrs. Wilson smiled at how much had changed. The street that had once been lit by harsh police lights now glowed with warmth from porch lamps and garden solar lights. The sound of friendly chatter and children's laughter had replaced the tension of that night. Her cross-stitch, showing a pattern of intertwined hands of different colors, was nearly complete, a testament to the healing power of community and understanding.